In the winter of 1756-57, Frederick collectedly augmented and prepared his army for the inevitable war, which spring would bring. Sure, he could look back on a somewhat satisfactory end of his surprise attack against the Saxons. Thanks to their surrender, they wouldn't be a threat. He consolidated his control over the principality during winter. He expelled the king, who took up residence in Warsaw. Incorporating Saxon soldiers in his army provided 10 new regiments, not to mention the food, material, and capital his new conquest provided. The great powers wouldn't be able to use the electorate as a springboard against Brandenburg's heartland. But the Battle of Lobositz did not grant him the victory he so desperately required to knock anyone out of the war. The Saxon soldiers proved a liability rather than an asset. In spring 1757, 2 regiments disbanded for sedition, and another escaped to Poland. With the international anti-Prussian alliance gaining momentum, Frederick rightly worried about invasions against his kingdom once winter was over. The Russians would invade from the east, the Swedes from the north, the French from the west, and of course Austria from the south. Moreover, the Imperial Diet declared war against Prussia that winter, leading to an extra worry. The West now was also prone to imperial invasions. Frederick quartered in Dresden throughout the winter, building up his army and preparing them for the inevitable campaign through the Bohemian hills against Prague. In Prague, the Austrian Field Marshal Braun also prepared for the year to come. He divided his army into 4 parts. In Eger, he stationed 30,000 soldiers under Charles Marie, Duke Arenberg. If the French managed to reach Bohemia by spring, these had to link up with him. 50,000 quartered at Budin, 30,000 under Count Christian Moritz von Koenigsegg und Rothfels quartered close to the Lusatian border. The remaining 30,000 were stationed at Königgrätz. In April 1757, Frederick deployed his 120,000 strong army along the Bohemian frontier. They were divided into 4 separate units. The plan was to incrementally march into Bohemia across a 100-mile front. Their goal was to converge north of Prague. Prince Moritz of Anhalt-Dessau, commanding 20,000 soldiers, advanced towards the Eger Valley from the west. Marshal August Wilhelm, Duke of Brunswick-Bevern, commanding 16,000, invaded from Lusatia. The center north. Schwerin invaded from Silesia, commanding some 34,000. Bevern and Schwerin were to link up with each other at Sobotka and launch an attack against Jungbunslau. Frederick would march via Lobositz with 40,000 soldiers and a 3,900 wagon strong baggage train. On April 18, the invasion began. Count Schwerin embarked on his march. 2 days later, Bevern marched into Bohemia. Bevern commanded some 15,000 troops. He was aware that a 23,000 strong Austrian army under Count Koenigsegg quartered on his route near Reichenberg. He hoped they would move towards Schwerin once scouts confirmed the Prussians launched their invasion. This was idle hope, and that same day his vanguard already encountered some of Koenigsegg's soldiers. The Austrian commander immediately dispatched messengers to nearby strongholds requesting reinforcements. Meanwhile, in Prague, Field Marshal Maximilian Ulysses von Braun received news of Schwerin's invasion. The Prussian army accumulating to Bohemia's west and northeast unnerved Braun, who traveled to his force in Budin. He also ordered Duke Arenberg to move his corps from Eger to join him. On the late evening of April 20, Bevern arrived north of Reichenberg, where, as expected, Koenigsegg defended the town. They knew they had to delay the Prussians as much as possible. Some Austrian detachments were quartered to different villages. To their west at Gabel, Count Macquarie moved north to cut off Bevern's communication line. However, some of Bevern's hussars halted their advance and Macquarie was forced to return to Gabel. Meanwhile, General Franz Moritz von Lacy and a few of his soldiers rapidly approached Reichenberg as reinforcements. Close by, another Austrian force under Colonel Karl Prinz von Liechtenstein, numbering some 800 cavalry and 300 infantry, was reluctant to leave their position at Grötau to reinforce Reichenberg. Commander Georg Ludwig von Puttkamer quickly capitalized on this by attacking Grötau. After a brief skirmish, Liechtenstein's force was scattered. Puttkammer seized 60 horses and many prisoners. Liechtenstein hurried to Reichenberg, together with whatever of his battered force remained. Puttkammer followed him. In the late evening of April 20, Bevern and his army approached Reichenberg. He positioned his army behind a brook, separating him from the Austrians. They set up camp and built a bridge to cross in the morning. In total, Koenigsegg commanded between 14 and 17,000 soldiers. These comprised 14 infantry battalions, 15 grenadier companies, and some 3,400 horsemen in 22 squadrons. In addition, he fielded approximately 78 artillery pieces. The Austrians erected barriers and placed their batteries in anticipation of the battle. They put up their ramps on the elevation in front of Reichenberg and a thick forest to the far left. Letters survive stating the thick forest made it difficult for any kind of troops to pass. The Austrians were flanked by two rises, the Iser and Jeschke. They held the strategic high ground. Behind them lay several valleys encircled by elevations. Bevern commanded 15 battalions and 20 squadrons, 11,300 infantry and 3,100 cavalry. He fielded 40 artillery guns. It is safe to assume they enjoyed a slight numerical superiority. At dawn on April 21st, Bevern deployed his army parallel to the creek they had camped behind. The Austrian watchmen immediately informed their commanders battle was imminent. Koenigsegg too deployed his army in a long stretch from a hill in front of Reichenberg to the thick woodlands on their left. He reinforced his already strategically strong right flank, concentrating the majority of his army there. Lacy commanded this Austrian right. Liechtenstein, who arrived with his still shaken cavalry from the previous day's assault, commanded the Austrian cavalry. They took up positions in front of the Franzental. Koenigsegg held control of the Austrian center. After crossing the bridge, Bevern's men took their positions. General Hans Sigismund von Lestwitz commanded the Prussian left. The cavalry was concentrated on the right wing, commanded by Lieutenant General Friedrich Eugene von Württemberg. A few hundred hussars under Puttkammer were hidden away in the woods on the far right. Bevern took charge of the main infantry body. Bevern concentrated the main attack against the Austrian left, the least reinforced flank. Lestwitz advanced against the Austrian right to divert attention. The volleys of artillery on both sides marked the start of the battle. Because of the uneven terrain, occasionally the Prussian artillery fired straight into their advancing infantry. Not an ideal position to be in. Württemberg and his 15 cavalry squadrons launched the first assault against Liechtenstein. Both parties heavily clashed and fierce combat ensued. Meanwhile, the infantry continued their advance forward slightly to the left, but their advancement also allowed them to invade the Austrian center ranks entirely. The main body of infantry climbed the left slope of the Austrians' elevation. After exchanging musket volleys, savage close combat followed. The iron discipline of the Prussians once again proved superior, and the Austrian formations on the ramp began cracking. But whereas the infantry was already proving successful, the cavalry was in a more difficult position. They had launched 3 charges in a very short period, but none proved successful. Still, the Austrian cavalry drifted off from their infantry lines. The significant distance allowed the Austrians on the ramp to their right to fire away during the skirmish. It caused mounting casualties, with the Prussian infantry pushing back the Austrian defenders on the ramp to their left. The flank became exposed to fire from 2 sides. The Prussian cavalry retreated, unable to inflict decisive damage. But before Liechtenstein could recuperate, Bevern had already ordered the next assault. This time, 3 infantry battalions moved forward. They were tasked with climbing the Jeschke mountain on the Prussian right. They climbed through the forest only to outflank the infantry on the ramp. A brief skirmish broke out. During this skirmish, Puttkammer's hussars came into action. They launched a charge from their hidden positions, surprising the Austrian cavalry. When the surprised infantry on the ramp was routed, the Prussians gained an ideal position to fire away at the Austrian cavalry's flank. The confusion and damage the Prussian volleys caused allowed Württemberg to launch another charge with his dragoons. Again, they clashed with the Austrians, and another bloody, ferocious melee ensued. Meanwhile, Koenigsegg grasped the severity of the situation. Having had the strategic high ground, the Prussians now turned it around and were securely positioned on what had been the Austrian left. Bevern adequately used his momentum. He ordered the remainder of the infantry forward along in a straight line. It was time to take the center. They began scaling the slope. Battle ensued along the entire line as the Austrians were hard pressed and forced to give up more ground against the ever-advancing Prussians. But this didn't go on for very long, and many were pushed back towards the Franzental. Koenigsegg attempted to rally his men for a final counterattack, but the chaos was too much. Soldiers descended into a rout as the Prussian right wing nearly enveloped the main body of soldiers in a pincer movement. The situation became too dangerous, and Koenigsegg ordered the general retreat. Official documents written right after the battle revealed that the retreat was made in good order, covered by Count Lacy, who commanded the right. Ironically, his side, the strongest side, had barely seen any combat. In total, the battle had lasted for 5 hours. The Prussians suffered some 700 casualties, whereas Koenigsegg lost 900. Many of the Prussian casualties were caused by friendly fire. Koenigsegg's retreat allowed Bevern to penetrate Bohemia and continue the march towards the rendezvous point. Upon the victory, Brunswick freed the way which allowed him to continue his march against Prague. Despite poor road conditions and hilly terrain, the advance went rather well. Meanwhile, to the north of his military camp, Frederick told his brother that the upcoming victory would prove as decisive for the fate of present-day empires as Caesar's defeat of Pompey at Pharsalus in 48 BC had been for Rome. Perhaps a bit dramatic, but definitely understandable considering the importance of the upcoming Battle of Prague. Everyone was aware of its importance, and the battle would soon arrive. In spring 1757, the 7 Years' War's first autumn and winter campaign lay behind them. Europe stood at the brink of an enormous war, which would radically change the course of history. Frederick the Great launched his spring campaign with a 4-way invasion of Bohemia. In northeastern Bohemia, the first commander of his army to face combat was the Duke of Brunswick-Bevern. At Reichenberg, he managed to rout the Habsburg army meant to push back the Prussians. For Frederick, it was a promising start of the campaign. The invasion continued with momentum. 2 days after Reichenberg, Frederick crossed into Bohemia, expelled the Austrians from Linné, and positioned himself strategically to outflank the large Austrian army under Field Marshal Braun at Budin. Braun's reinforcements, commanded by Duke Arenberg, hadn't arrived yet, so Braun decided to retreat to the northwest of Prague. Meanwhile, the Prince of Anhalt-Dessau linked up with Frederick at Linné. To their east, Bevern captured Jungbunzlau, linking up with the 73-year-old Field Marshal Schwerin. The storehouses nearby ensured the ability to feed their 40,000 soldiers for close to a month. Thanks to their victory at Reichenberg, they would be able to form the right to Frederick's left pincer movement of the Bohemian capital. The Austrians were aware of the danger they faced. In the Austrian camp, Braun frantically tried to get his men ready for combat. As all these parties began planning for the inevitable upcoming battle, a well-known commander arrived in Braun's camp. Prince Charles of Lorraine, commander-in-chief of the Habsburg army, arrived in Prague in early May. The city was in disarray, fleeing citizens and decaying defenses. He took over command, and despite internal friction, every party understood it was the right move. Braun suffered from severe tuberculosis, but he remained in the field despite his condition. Charles called a council of war. They agreed they should meet Koenigsegg's corps, retreating and still shaken from Reichenberg, near Prague, on the right bank of the Moldau. They knew Marshal Daun marched from Moravia towards Königgrätz. Although they were in danger for now, their numbers were rapidly increasing. Charles augmented Prague's garrison with 13,000 troops. The remainder of the army, close to 60,000 soldiers, took their positions around the eastern part of the city. Meanwhile, the Prussians continued their advance. Frederick learned of the Austrians taking up their positions to the city's east. Marshal Keith, commanding 32,000 soldiers, remained on the left bank of the Moldau, while Frederick linked up with Schwerin to Prague's northeast. He commanded up to 64,000 troops. On the morning of May 6, Prince Charles wasn't worried about what the day would bring. His army held strong defensive positions, and even more reinforcements were on their way. But his confidence that day would be calm was misplaced. At around 5:30 a.m., Charles received alarming news from his irregulars. Austrian outposts were pushed back around Prussia. 30 minutes later, Charles ordered the battle formations. It seemed like a full-scale attack was imminent. Charles positioned his army to the north of Landeshut, the small village to Prague's east. His left flank rested against the Žižka hill. His command spanned along the Tabor hill towards Kay. Browne held the command of Austria's right wing, sharply bending south along Sterbohol. His right was held by cavalry. In total, up to 62,000 troops were deployed outside Prague. 70 infantry battalions, 124 cavalry squadrons, and up to 200 guns. Several thousand, including 5,000 cavalry, remained inside the city's walls. The Battle of Prague was a muddled and chaotic affair, even more than usual. As such, reconstructing certain parts of the battle is challenging and sometimes open to interpretation. Those first skirmishes at Prussia, alarming Charles, were conducted by Schwerin and Winterfeld. They commanded 2 columns. After taking Prussia, their army awaited Frederick's arrival. When he arrived a bit after 6 a.m., the Prussian army's size swelled to 64,000. In total, the Prussian king commanded 66 infantry battalions, 123 cavalry squadrons, and around 190 artillery pieces. The Prussians enjoyed a slight numerical superiority. But the king was in quite a sorry state. He suffered severe food poisoning and could barely ride his horse without throwing up. After a brief deliberation with his generals, they decided to move fast and concentrate the attack along the Austrian right flank. The Prussians immediately began their march with Lieutenant General Johann Karl Schönegg's dragoons moving far in advance as the vanguard. When Charles noticed this, he sent units from the center to augment the right. Some 15 regiments of cavalry under General Andras Hadik and 40 grenadier companies were concentrated around Sterbohol. The Austrian cavalry arrived just in time. Schönegg's dragoons launched a frontal cavalry charge, countered by the freshly arrived Austrians. A prolonged cavalry fight followed, lasting for the remainder of the battle. Meanwhile, in the background, Schwerin and Winterfeld led their soldiers past Possernitz. They faced continuous artillery shelling. Because the Prussian artillery could not traverse the marshy ground, they all concentrated along one narrow road. Cluttered with heavy guns, the road became obstructed. Consequently, the infantry had to walk through the marshy meadows and fields. Frankly, the terrain was quite inhospitable for the infantry, and men were already tiring. Finally, Schwerin's 14 infantry regiments took up their positions, facing the majority of Browne's infantry between Sterbohol and Kay. Frederick commanded the center, Schwerin in the left. Winterfeld commanded the right vanguard. Realizing the delay's danger, Winterfeld decided not to wait for official orders and ordered his 8 battalions to charge. They moved forward in their characteristic disciplined formation like a moving wall, traversing water, reaching their waist. They received orders not to fire until they came close to the Austrian lines. Frederick was unhappy with the early assault. Old Schwerin disagreed. Frische Eier, gute Eier, he said, meaning something like the early bird gets the worm, before leading his men into battle as well. Those were the last words he would ever speak to his king. The Austrian artillery on the Homolo hill and the grenadiers standing on its slopes fired volley after volley. Not retaliating, the Prussians suffered enormous casualties. The front lines received the brunt of the damage, and several units were near entirely decimated, if not routed. Moreover, the poor terrain conditions considerably slowed down their advance. General Winterfeld was among the front lines, leading by example. During the advance, an accurate shot hit him in the neck. He was severely wounded as he fell from his horse. Schwerin and several of his most trusted officers moved forward to carry Winterfeld back to safety. Schwerin rode in the front as his men carried Winterfeld away, ready to lead by example. As he continued the advance, a canister blast mortally struck his head, removing most of it. He died on impact. Austrian artillery continued tearing through Prussian lines. The charge had been an absolute disaster so far. The battle had been going on for a while now, and at around 11 a.m. the Austrian inroads against the Prussian lines showed. Things were not looking good. Confident he was capitalizing on his success, Braun launched what he was confident would be the last charge against the Prussians. But nearby the city of Kay, held by Königsegg, the Prussian commanders noticed a gap between Charles's north-facing troops and Braun's eastern lines. The charge would prove to be a crucial mistake. Beveren commanded the infantry nearby, although sources indicate regimental commanders acted on their own accord. They mounted a full charge. Facing little resistance, they managed to flank Königsegg's infantry. Suddenly, the Austrian position did not seem so stable. Braun's men fiercely resisted the Prussians, and savage combat broke out. This charge nearby Kay is generally considered to be the turning point of the battle. During all this intense fighting, more misfortune struck the Austrians. A cannonball struck Braun. It shattered his leg, and he had to be carried away from the battlefield. As the fortunes were changing for Austria, they were left leaderless. Throughout the entire battle, General von Zieten had been roaming the rear of the Prussian lines. All the way to the south, he saw an opening of the Austrian right flank. He didn't think for too long, and he ordered his hussars to launch a charge against Hadik. The clash was enormous and somewhat unexpected. The impact quickly spread through the Austrian lines like a shockwave. Suddenly, Zieten turned the indecisive cavalry battle. Many infantry regiments realized the sudden gravity of the situation. They were close to getting stuck in a pincer movement. All troops between Sterbohol and Hostavitz collapsed. Many retreated towards Prague, and a significant force retreated to the south. During this, Prince Charles collapsed. It is unclear what happened, but he likely suffered a seizure, leaving him incapacitated. Austrian commanders rallied some retreating Austrian infantry behind the Tabor hill. As the Prussians chased the infantry, fierce resistance blocked their passage. They inflicted heavy casualties. Meanwhile, Manstein became frustrated with his lack of combat. He decided to launch a charge of his own accord. To his right stood Prince Henry, who crossed the Rokenitzer stream to support Manstein in a famous event. The Austrians holding the northern lines put up fierce resistance, but both commanding generals were quickly killed. The infantry soon gave way. Prince Henry appeared to the northwest of the Austrian lines. To their south, von Zieten advanced along Neustrassnitz. Again, the Austrians risked becoming stuck in a pincer movement and retreated towards Prague. The Austrian cavalry remained disciplined enough to continue brief counterattacks, protecting their infantry during the entire retreat. Most soldiers managed to find refuge in Prague, though a force of around 12,000 fled to the south. Pursuing them was unthinkable. The battlefield was littered with dead and dying men. The casualties during the battle mounted to astonishing levels. Contemporary plays and ballads referring to the battle used it synonymously for slaughter and massacre. The Prussians suffered 3,099 dead, 8,208 wounded, with many succumbing to their injuries, and 1,657 missing. 400 officers were among the killed, 1 field marshal, 1 general, and 3 other generals were mortally wounded. These official figures are commonly thought to be underreported, with the actual figures being even higher. The Austrians suffered fewer number of casualties, totaling some 13,400. Again, among them some 400 officers. Many of them were prisoners of war. Sure, it was a Prussian victory, but an incredibly costly one at that. The death of several senior officers on both sides and Frederick's incapacitation due to food poisoning made the entire battle quite a muddled affair. Besides Schwerin and Winterfeld, Generals Fouquet and Courcelles were severely injured, while their regiments suffered over 50% casualties. Frederick later wrote to King George he lost Schwerin, who he referred to as one of the greatest generals of the century. But admitting his losses wasn't the same as admitting the battle had been more costly than he anticipated. To his sister, he wrote he had totally beaten the Austrian army. They are entirely separated, and I hope to take most of the generals and soldiers in Prague as prisoners of war. His mother received a letter in which he boasted of being free with 150,000 men, while he dispersed the Austrians in the wind. This was all window dressing, to put it bluntly. In private, Frederick admitted to the gravity of the situation. He blamed more or less every subordinate of his, and surviving letters reveal his generals and his brothers blamed him in turn. But he did learn from his mistakes. For example, firing volleys during marching was a tactic he disavowed, but now reinstated. As a result, his troops would never again have to hold fire during their advance forward. As for Austria, the defeat certainly put Vienna on high alert. Their French allies weren't too impressed with their conduct. The cannonball shattering Brown's legs proved fatal. He died on June 26. Austria lost one of her best, if not the best general, Frederick wrote. The battle's aftermath didn't play in Frederick's favor. Over 46,000 soldiers now defended Prague, and it soon turned out they were well provisioned, contrary to what Frederick assumed. And remember the 12,000 odd troops who didn't flee Prague but turned south? Well, in the southeast, Austrian Field Marshal Daun was assembling a 55,000 strong army welcoming most of these soldiers. Frederick established siege batteries and briefly bombarded Prague. But once news reached him of Daun's large Austrian army, he decided he would not be able to continue the siege of Prague with this danger looming. He began preparing the march towards his next battle, which would become the famous Battle of Kolin. The 1757 Battle of Prague was an incredibly bloody and costly affair for Austria and Prussia. Suffering enormous casualties, Prussia's King Frederick the Great emerged victoriously. Still, the fleeing Austrians retreated behind the Bohemian capital's walls. Frederick was convinced he could force the city and its garrison to its knees. On May 29, he began the bombardment of Prague. With 10 25-pounder guns and 12 heavy mortars, the Prussians fired over 30,000 shells. But the garrison in Prague evidently enjoyed more provisions and tenacity than Frederick anticipated. Then horrifying news reached him. By early June, he learned of Field Marshal Leopold Count von Daun assembling a new large army to the east. Initially, Frederick assumed this was no more than 20,000 troops. Daun probably retreated with them after learning of the Austrian defeat at Prague. But General Georg Puttkamer, who chased the fleeing Austrian garrison, relayed to him Daun commanded 55,000 soldiers, including those who fled the Battle of Prague. This was a serious problem. Frederick did not have enough resources to conduct a siege and face a massive army simultaneously. Daun was no stranger to Frederick, although the Prussian king didn't know it. The Austrian field marshal made a name for himself a decade earlier, seeing combat at Chotusitz, Hohenfriedberg, and Soor. Whereas Daun had ample opportunity to study Frederick as a commander, Frederick barely knew anything about him. This was the first time he faced an army commanded by Daun. Upon learning of Daun's strength, Frederick's first act was to dispatch the Duke of Brunswick-Bevern in Kolin's direction. With a 19,000-strong army, he marched east, capturing supply depots along the way. Meanwhile, the Prussians were slowly grasping the severity and impact the Battle of Prague caused to their army. The situation was bad. The final figures of Prague were worse than expected. A surviving account of one of the Prussian officers clearing the battlefield reveals: "It is dreadful beyond conception to walk in a field of battle after victory, to see friends and enemies, men and horses, the dead and dying all heaped together and almost floating in blood. The stench of carnage fills the air with infection, and the groans of those who yet live rise as if in union on every side." Then Frederick received news of a new Franco-Austrian treaty in which France pledged 120,000 soldiers and not laid down arms until Austria captured Silesia entirely. Letters from the Duchy of Prussia revealed a Russian fleet entered the Baltic Sea, and an Austrian deserter confirmed Frederick's worst fear. Prague held enough provisions to last a couple of months at least. Not knowing what to expect of his adversary, Frederick decided to raise a force and travel east. He left Field Marshal Keith in charge of the siege of Prague. A letter he wrote Keith on June 6 reveals he was confident but serious about the situation. "Leopold Daun is being reinforced. We must prevent him interfering with us. We must put together all we can, attack him, and chase him away as far as possible." On June 14, Frederick linked up with Bevern nearby Kolin. Bevern informed him that Daun was commanding a worrisome large army. Daun camped near Czoslau and had just received direct orders from Maria Theresa to relieve Prague's garrison. He ran into Zieten's hussars multiple times, preventing a direct attack against Bevern's force, but certainly alerting him that the Prussians knew of his whereabouts. Frederick did not know about Daun's goal to relieve Prague, but he did suspect battle was imminent. He sent word to Prince Moritz of Anhalt-Dessau at Prague. Moritz rounded up any and all soldiers he could find who would not be missed during the siege. 48 hours later, Moritz arrived at Kolin with reinforcements. Frederick commanded some 35,000 men. Daun still outnumbered him significantly by some 20,000. Thanks to the skirmishes, Daun was well aware that the Prussians were in the region. His scouts informed him of Bevern's army, augmented by Frederick and Moritz. With some characteristic cautious maneuvering, Daun marched against the Prussians, reaching their flank. On the evening of June 16, he deployed his army in two lines on the slight slopes south of the Imperial Road. They spanned from Blinka all the way towards Ksechers. Irregulars under General Beck held Planyan. Nadashti's irregulars remained south of the main army, able to move towards whichever flank required them. The Austrian movements did not go unnoticed. Frederick camped nearby Kurin and realized Daun attempted to cut them off. He decided to move his entire army to the north. Meanwhile, Daun received a false message that Frederick expected up to 60,000 reinforcements later that night. So Daun expanded his lines, with his left towards Krichnau and his right towards Radovesnitz. By the morning of June 18, Daun's men were ready. He commanded between 28 and 34,000 infantry, between 14 and 18,600 cavalry, and around 150 artillery pieces. Meanwhile, Frederick decided it was time to move. Surely he could circumvent Daun's army, reach the east's lower slopes and flank the Austrians. When Beck was quickly expelled from Planyan, his confidence grew. Adhering to that strategy, his commanders ordered their army forward. In total, Frederick commanded between 32 and 34,000 soldiers, 18,000 infantry, 14,000 cavalry, and some 88 guns. Frederick kept part of his cavalry in reserve for a mopping-up operation, or reinforcements if need be. He had no idea Daun extended his position to Ksechers and Radovesnitz. At noon on June 18, an exceptionally dry and hot summer's day, the Prussian columns began their march from Planyan. General Johann Dietrich von Hülsen commanded the vanguard. Lieutenant General von Treschkow followed with his division. Ziethen commanded some 50 squadrons of hussars to protect the flank. Manstein commanded the middle and Bevern the right. As the Prussian column marched, news reached Frederick that it may take longer than anticipated to circumvent the Austrians. Rumors of Daun expanding his lines east worried the king. Some woodlands, the Eichenwald, lay south of Gzechers. When the Austrian bombardment erupted, Frederick figured passing through the woodlands would achieve the same encirclement effect with fewer casualties. He told Hülsen to explore the shortcut. But Frederick had no idea that this uphill shortcut marched straight into General von Witt's hidden division. Combined with the infantry deployed within the village, the Austrians were about to shoot at the oblivious Prussians like fish in a barrel. When they turned south, parallel to Gzechers, indeed the Prussian infantry came under heavy fire. Hearing the noise of battle and volleys, Frederick deduced the Austrian right flank was much stronger than he anticipated. This was it. There was no more time for elaborate maneuvering. As Ziethen ran into Nadashti's cavalry to the east, Frederick ordered Moritz to launch a frontal charge against the Austrian positions. Statements survive of Moritz telling Frederick the idea was ridiculous, but to no avail. Fraser writes the infantry marched forward in a frontal attack uphill, outnumbered and with no favorable circumstances whatsoever. It was a desperate maneuver. The Austrian infantry and artillery, safely positioned on the Gzechers hill, launched volley after volley. They tore into Moritz's division. The prince reportedly exclaimed the battle was lost. Meanwhile, the rest of the Prussian column was still trekking along the Imperial Road and taking their positions. Pro-Red sharpshooters positioned around Brezan picked off soldiers on the flank. In an attempt to mitigate the casualties, Major General von Manstein took part of his army and charged into the village direction. He scattered the sharpshooters. However, the town enjoyed more defenders than he anticipated, and as savage fighting erupted, he called in support of his reserves. As the fighting around Brezan and Chosenitz continued, his soldiers slowly pushed towards the hill. The advance began extending beyond what Manstein intended, but the chaos on the ground prevented him from pulling his army back safely. Several detachments began climbing the Przerovsky hill. Along most of the Prussian front, the scene was the same. Infantry climbing over their dead or dying comrades, sustaining heavy fire. But Manstein's attack did ensure the Austrians could not reinforce their right flank. In utter desperation at his lack of reinforcements, Frederick ordered 67-year-old General Peter von Pennever to launch a cavalry charge. They advanced past Brezan before being mauled by heavy artillery fire and a subsequent cavalry counterattack. Despite the casualties, at around 7 p.m., Moritz's infantry reached the top of the Gzechers hill. The subsequent close combat appeared to favor the Prussians. Another charge launched by Bevern pushed into the Austrian left flank, on top of the Przerovsky. Then on the far left of the Prussians, Major General Christian von Krosigk launched a charge against the village. The combination of the sudden momentum, the Prussian advance, and the Austrians running out of ammunition and wavering lines made it seem like Prussia was about to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. It would not have been the first time, but it just wasn't enough. Krosigk was struck by a cannonball, dying on impact. Fighting continued for a while, but the brigade began wavering before cracking and scattering. Pennever's damaged cavalry retreated to the Imperial Road. The Prussian infantry was exhausted and battered. Whenever they made an opening in the Austrian lines, it was filled with fresh reserves. Finally, the late Krosigk's cavalry suffered heavy counterattacks by the much more numerous Austrian cavalry stationed near the Eichenwald. Bevern's infantry suffered heavy casualties, battered by the artillery and infantry on the hill. Some sources indicate Bevern managed to scale the hill and line up his army. But the flanking of the Netherland Linie Dragoon Regiment from the left crushed his infantry, and they retreated to the Imperial Road. On the left, the Austrian cavalry surrounded the Prussian vanguard. Breshkov was wounded and captured, together with his infantry. At around 8 p.m. the Prussians retreated. Zieten and Hülsen maintained order among their troops, preventing Daun from following up the victory with a chase. Kolin's score was gruesome. The Prussian army received an enormous blow. Of their infantry, 8,755 were killed or missing, 3,568 were wounded. Of the cavalry, 1,450 men and even more horses were killed. To put this into perspective, over a third of the troops deployed became a casualty statistic. They lost an additional 5,380 men as POWs. Daun lost 8,114 soldiers, most of whom were wounded, totaling about 15% of the troops deployed. The Austrians camped on the field, a classic sign of victory. When news of the victory reached Vienna, the city burst into spontaneous celebration. Maria Theresa created the eponymous order, awarding Daun the first Grand Cross. Allegorical works were written and the Pope conferred his indescribable jubilation. As you can imagine, the mood in Berlin stood in stark contrast to these jubilations. After nearly 2 decades of incredible successes, this defeat served as a cold shower to the Prussians. Tim Blenning writes, "In just a few hours, Frederick lost more than a battle. His superhuman reputation had collapsed." Austrian memoirs reveal how their opinion of Prussian soldiers shifted. It turned out they could be made to flee. In a letter to Marshal Keith, Frederick conceded he had tried to do too much with too few. He became depressed and disillusioned, ordering Prince Henry to prepare to lift the siege of Prague. His cynic wit shows in one of his letters, "Success breeds overconfidence, and the next time I will do better. Every man must have his setbacks, and it seems I shall have mine." In his political testament, written 11 years after the battle, Frederick wrote how if they had won at Kolin, the Austrian army in Prague would have had to capitulate, the French army would not have crossed the Rhine, the Russians would have stayed at home, and Austria would have had to make peace on Prussian terms. Blenning remarks very much to the point. In the event, the opposites of those things happened, and with them, the defeat transformed the very nature of the war. Frederick's war was about to turn into a war of attrition, and his enemies were more than ready to capitalize on the Austrian success. In the summer of 1757, Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, received barely, if any, positive news about the progress of the ongoing war. The defeat at Kolin in June put a considerable dent in the Prussian war machine. Frederick raised the siege of Prague and debated on what to do. Initially, he wanted to retreat to Saxony, but he tried to maintain much of his conquered Bohemian territory instead. He divided his army into 2 equal parts. At Leitmeritz, Frederick commanded some 34,000 soldiers. His brother August Wilhelm commanded an equal number of men to his east. These fed off the magazine at Zittau in Upper Lusatia. Frederick told him it was of vital importance to defend the supply depots and entrances into Silesia. Meanwhile, irregulars under Nadashdy and Beck infested the main roads and villages around the frontier. Frederick spent some of his most unhappy days in the palace at Leitmeritz. On June 28, news reached him of his mother's death. When he found out, he wrote to his sister Wilhelmine, "All misfortunes overwhelm me at the same time. This loss is the culmination of my sorrows, and yet I am forced to act, and I do not have time to give full course to my tears. All the losses in this world may be redressed, but those occasioned by death are beyond remedy." He indeed did not have time to grieve. In Bohemia, 110,000 Austrians were ready to advance. To his east, 100,000 Russians under Field Marshal Stepan Apraksin moved against his duchy. To his west, 125,000 French were becoming a significant danger for his Hanoverian allies. Under Prince de Soubise, they already conquered Prussia's clave possessions, and a 70,000-strong army under Count d'Estrées now directed their march against Hanover. And to top it all off, another army, the 40,000-strong Reichsexecutionarmee, consisting of imperial soldiers commanded by Field Marshal Prince Joseph von Sachsen-Hildburghausen, were on the move to link up with the French. Through diplomacy, Prussia continued attempting to establish peace with France, to no avail. Worrisome news from Sweden reached Frederick as well. They were preparing an invasion force to seize Pomerania. It wouldn't be until September 13 till they landed, but it opened another front. 3 main fronts opened: the south around Silesia and Saxony against the Austrians, the west against the French and Imperial Army, the east against the Russians. Facing over 400,000 hostile troops, Frederick amassed no more than 154,000 soldiers. Up to 64,000 were stationed on the Bohemian frontier against the Austrians. 10,000 remained in Brandenburg as reserves defending the capital and Pomerania. No more than 30,000 were dispatched to East Prussia under 70-year-old Field Marshal Hans von Lewald. An additional 54,000 soldiers, although many of them were British and Hanoverian, served under the Duke of Cumberland against the advancing French and Imperial Army. The first action occurred on the Bohemian front. Contrary to Frederick's expectations, the Austrians focused their assault to the east against August Wilhelm's army. This was entirely unexpected, and it showed. On July 15, the Austrians under Duke Arenberg seized Gabel, capturing Puttkamer. August Wilhelm was outmaneuvered. The Austrians continued with a vengeance, and 8 days later, they fell onto Zittau. Just like that, they seized a depot which could have sustained 40,000 soldiers for a month. Again, a massive blow to Prussia. The Austrians used Zittau as a springboard to launch raids into Silesia throughout the summer. August Wilhelm retreated to the west with a highly demoralized army, suffering continued attacks by irregulars. His poor managed retreat left the path to Silesia wide open. Bad news continued. 3 days after Zittau, a French army under Marshal d'Estrées defeated the Duke of Cumberland's army at Hastenbeck. Negotiations between the French and Hanover opened. This worried Frederick. The withdrawal from Hanover, and thus Great Britain, from the war would severely weaken Prussia's western frontier. Additionally, a French army under Marshal Soubise, stationed in Strasbourg, preyed on the Prussians. The king met his brother at Bautzen. After the meeting, the prince reportedly departed in tears. A surviving letter Frederick sent to him does not leave much to the imagination. "You make me pay a high price for the confidence I reposed in you. Never again will you, August Wilhelm, command another army to ruin. To my way of thinking, your splendid expedition was nothing more than the impulse from some superannuated, spoiled child, from whom we take a knife lest he should cut himself and injure others. The prince and his generals deserve to be sentenced to death by court-martial, but his position prevents this." August Wilhelm resigned from the army not soon after. He passed away, likely from a cerebral hemorrhage, before the animosity between the brothers could be resolved. In the wake of his retreat, Frederick traveled to Silesia to reassemble his army north of Zittau. He commanded some 65,000 men. Primary sources conflict about the army's state. Some mention the army being re-energized thanks to the king's presence. Others mention it was demoralized. Prince Henry supposedly talked the king out of several near-suicidal attacks against the Austrians during these days. Heeding Henry's advice, Frederick returned to Dresden with 25,000 soldiers to take stock. He ordered Bevern at Gorlitz to defend Silesia with some 40,000 men. General Winterfeld was assigned to assist Bevern. Frederick concluded the most dangerous problems was the French. They even refused his peace offerings, promising millions of thalers as indemnity. Likely because Madame de Pompadour, the French king's mistress, had a strong dislike for Frederick. The feeling was mutual. But to his east, trouble continued brewing. General Beck, Nadashti, and Arenberg, among many other Austrian commanders, roamed the frontier. One of these commanders frequently raiding Silesia was Colonel Janusz von Eberstadt. Already in early July, he captured Landeshut, although some sources indicate he captured it as late as August 10. But Landeshut too became a hub for irregular incursions against Silesia. Prussian scouts relayed this information to Major General Johann Friedrich von Kreitzen, stationed nearby. The general now set out to surprise Janus and expel him from his stronghold. After weeks of maneuvering around each other, Kreitzen finally decided to mount an assault against the stronghold. Although Prussian reconnaissance was poor, Kreitzen rightly suspected Janis outnumbered him. Unfortunately, sources aren't very detailed about the number of units involved. Kreitzen commanded some 3,000 soldiers. Janis commanded some 4,000. Many of them were Croat irregulars, and many of them were cavalry. Kreitzen devised a plan to expel Janis from Landeshut without engaging in any large-scale battle, by surprising him. On August 12, his army set out to march from the northeast towards Vogelsdorf, a village to the north of Landeshut. After a night of marching, Kreitzen arrived at Vogelsdorf. Far in this vanguard, his hussars ran into several light Grenzer troops roaming the forest. It soon became clear the Prussians were outnumbered, and after a brief skirmish, the hussars retreated to relay their findings to Kreitzen. The Austrian light infantry continued roaming around the Buchberg forest. The Grenzer outposts roaming the forest prevented the Prussian troops from moving past Vogelsdorf and locating the main Austrian encampment. Only thanks to some campfires burning south of Landeshut near the Kirchberg could they roughly pinpoint Janis's position. Despite having marched all night and day and having incomplete information, Kreitzen decided to mount an attack that evening. He hoped his army would swiftly get rid of the light infantry on the Buchberg, while the rest captured Landeshut to secure a stronghold against Janis's main army. The march commenced at 7 p.m. Unfortunately for Kreitzen, he misjudged the time it took to reach the Buchberg. When night fell, he had to order his army to halt because they could not correctly assess the enemy's positions. The Prussian position was an incredibly dangerous one. Amidst the meadows and fields with barely any cover, Kreitzen ordered his army in a large square, protecting his baggage train. Behind them stood the hussars, ready to use their agility in battle. During this rather clumsy advance by the Prussians, Janis had been well aware of their movements. There was a complete lack of interaction by his soldiers, however, for a good reason. As night fell and the Prussians formed an infantry square, Janusz sent agile light infantry detachments to harass the Prussian flanks. Then, with his main army south of Landeshut, Janis began moving towards Kreitzen's southeast. Amidst the darkness, suddenly Prussian soldiers were picked off one by one. Parts of the Prussian formation became chaotic, firing at random. The general staff reports of the battle mention multiple friendly fire casualties. During these hours of chaos, horses broke loose with Janusz's men capturing at least 30. In addition, around 100 Saxons forcibly enlisted in the Prussian army decided this was a splendid time to desert. Amidst the darkness and chaos in front of the Buchberg, Janusz reached the forest. His army deployed in the tree line, including at least 6 heavy guns. Kreitzen realized he was in danger in the valley, although he likely was unaware of Janusz's real movements. As the Austrians took their positions, Kreitzen ordered his army to retreat to Vogelsdorf while maintaining their square formation. The supply wagons heavily impeded their movement speed. By this point, dawn was setting in. When the first rays of sun illuminated the plain, Janis saw the Prussians haphazardly retreating. He ordered his artillery and infantry to open fire. The quiet morning was polluted by sounds of heavy artillery fire as the shells struck the ground around the Prussians. Sources indicate the accuracy was nothing to write home about, and the artillery inflicted barely any casualties. But it did ensure complete panic in the Prussian lines and the abandonment of their entire baggage train. Disregarding the misfortune, Kreitzen managed to rally his men within the valley. He ordered his infantry in a straight line. Janusz deployed his infantry in a similar fashion, resulting in 2 infantry lines running parallel to each other. Kreitzen was the first to order the general attack. His infantry moved forward against the Austrian position on the slopes of the Buchberg. The charge enjoyed incredible momentum. Sure, the Prussians suffered heavy artillery and musket fire from the Austrians, but they were bloodthirsty. They pushed the Austrian infantry back onto the slopes of the Buchberg before pushing them into the forest altogether. In addition, they seized several Austrian artillery pieces. But because Janusz enjoyed numerical superiority, he had a trick up his sleeve. His Grenzer battalions to the Prussian right were in an ideal position to flank the ever-advancing infantry. They did so, drawing their sabers and charging into the Prussian lines. Meanwhile, his remaining artillery fired volleys of grape shot. This tore into the infantry lines. Brief, ferocious combat ensued. As the reports from the general staff indicate, the unusual sight had immediate effect on the morale of the Prussians. Their lines wavered, they yielded ground and became dispersed. The combination of grape shot, the flanking, and close combat in the tree line mauled the infantry. Before too long, the Prussian lines broke entirely, and the surviving infantry soldiers retreated, suffering fire along the way. Because the Prussian infantry body deteriorated into chaos, several units fled in the wrong direction. In total, the Prussians lost 1,337 men and 30 officers. The Austrians captured most of them. Among them was an entire battalion which ended up surrounded and forced to surrender. The Austrians lost 3 officers and 96 men. The Battle of Landeshut was nothing more than a footnote, if that, in literature about the 7 Years' War. But it perfectly illustrates the trouble for Prussia during this conflict. Even if they enjoyed momentum, they generally were outnumbered. The aftermath of the battle was emblematic for the Silesian and Bohemian campaign of the 7 Years' War. Prussia's defeat ensured the Austrians were free to use the strongholds along the Silesian border to conduct raids into the province. Janusz was promoted to Major General for his victory. It wasn't until midwinter that Frederick was able to mount an adequate response to the Austrian presence on his frontier. But for now, more pressing issues captured his attention. In the west, the French and Reichsarmee were preparing to link up and attack Prussia. And in the east, the Russians too had learned of the Prussian defeat at Kolin, and their enormous invasion force was rapidly gaining ground. The heavily outnumbered Field Marshal Lewald was the only one standing in between Field Marshal Apraksin's Russians and the entire Duchy of Prussia. At the famous Battle of Gross-Jägersdorf, they would decide the future of Prussia's east. In the summer of 1757, things were not looking good for Prussia. Its King Frederick the Great often wondered if his participation in what would become known as the 7 Years' War had been the greatest mistake of his life. After the costly victory of the Battle of Prague, Prussia suffered a decisive defeat at the hands of a much larger Austrian army at Kolin. In the aftermath of Kolin, Frederick retreated to Silesia and Saxony in an attempt to hold the frontiers there. The theaters of war during this time can be roughly divided into 3 parts. A large French army and the Reichsarmee threatened Prussia's western flank. In July, a combined Hanoverian Hessian army under the Duke of Cumberland was defeated by General d'Estrées, opening the way to Brandenburg and Saxony. To the south, the Austrian army under Field Marshal Daun and Prince Charles of Lorraine threatened Prussia's heartland, not to mention the constant raids by irregulars against towns and villages. This was exemplified by the defeat of a Prussian army at Landeshut. Though not a decisive monumental battle, it illustrated Prussia's problem. They were nearly always heavily outnumbered. But through it all, the most significant problem logistics-wise was East Prussia. The duchy was separated by over 300 miles, around 500 kilometers, of Polish territory. Moreover, because of Russia's lukewarm feelings towards the French and British and their abysmal supply line infrastructure. The conflict on Prussia's eastern frontier had not yet escalated to combat. Frankly, the Eastern Front had been dormant so far, but news of the defeat at Kolin also reached the east, and things began moving. The Russians learned of Prussia's recent defeat and sent 2 armies to the duchy. 18,000 soldiers under Count William Firmer laid siege to Memel. Another army numbering some 70,000 under Field Marshal Stepan Apraksin crossed the Niemen River, slowly advancing towards Wehlau. The Russian army, especially its Cossacks, were notorious for its plunderings and general disobedience. The invasion was no exception. In early July, Firmer captured Memel, establishing the main supply base and departing to link up with Apraksin. The first reports of Cossack plunderings reached Frederick on July 17. He had the looming danger in the west and south to worry about, and ordered the heavily outnumbered 70-year-old Field Marshal Hans von Lewald to hold the duchy with 25,000 soldiers. The king wasn't too worried that unruly bunch would stand no chance against the disciplined Prussians. Additionally, the Russian supply lines were stretched beyond what could reasonably maintain an army. As a result, tens of thousands of soldiers were foraging the woods and plundering villages, but marauders were not. Fact of the matter was that the Russians advanced against the Prussians. In late August, Apraxin continued his advance against Lewald, stationed at Wehlau. Lewald received no specific orders, only to face the Russian army as he saw fit. Historians mention his advanced age and his inexperience as an autonomous commander. But given these facts, it makes it all the more surprising what happened next, because due to some rapid and unexpected maneuvering, the Prussian army surprised the Russians between the villages of Gross-Jägersdorf and Norrköthen.
On the evening of August 29, Lewald and his army arrived nearby the village of Puschdorf. They set up camp between the village and the woodlands, but not for long. That night, the Prussians prepared a march against the Russians in what would hopefully culminate in a deadly surprise attack. Lewald commanded approximately 25,000 to 27,700 soldiers, 17,000 infantry in 22 battalions, 8,200 horsemen in 50 squadrons, and 55 artillery pieces. Field Marshal Stepan Apraxin commanded at least double that. Sources differ a little bit, but it is generally assumed he commanded between 55,000 and 75,000 soldiers. At least 36,200 infantry, 18,600 cavalry, and 263 guns. The Russians camped between Usbunsen and around the Pregal near Norrköthen. Their surroundings consisted of marshes and woodlands. The Russians outnumbered the Prussians at least 2 to 1. At around 2 a.m. that day, unbeknownst to them, Lewald ordered the entire Prussian army to march in 3 columns through the woodlands towards Gross-Jägersdorf. The Duke of Holstein commanded the south, Lieutenant General Schorlemer the north, and Lewald the center. Despite hoping to surprise the Russians, there is reason to assume Apraxin could have prepared for the Prussian attack with the knowledge of hindsight. His Cossack scouts had already informed him of the advancing Prussians in late August. However, because of the lack of deployed guards, the advancing Prussian army wasn't spotted, and the situation didn't put the Russians on high alert. At 4 a.m., a misty dawn, the Russian soldiers slowly awoke and began preparing for their march. The Russian cavalry and Cossacks moved from their camp at Usbunsen down south, along the road towards Allenburg. Firmer's division was delayed, resulting in only half of the Russian cavalry moving south. To the west, Lewald's army advanced. When he saw the Russian cavalry trekking south, he ordered the Duke of Holstein with 20 whole squadrons to move against the vanguard. Next, he ordered Lieutenant General Schorlemer's cavalry to move towards Leuthen in the north. If successful, the Prussians would mount a surprise attack against both the north and southern flank. Lewald maintained command of the Prussian army, covering the entire center. They deployed in front of Gross-Jägersdorf and Uderballen. Thanks to the morning fog, the Russians overlooked the advancing Prussians at first. A Russian battery nearby Leuthen was the first to notice Schorlemer's advancing cavalry. They opened fire, alerting their comrades that battle was likely imminent. However, upon hearing the noise, several units collapsed in disorder as their officers frantically sought to deploy. Frankly, it already was chaos as the Prussian infantry appeared in front of the marching column. The Prussian infantry and cavalry soon fought against haphazardly formed Russian vanguards. They pressed the attack and aggressively pushed into their lines. Eyewitness accounts survive of Russian officers caught by total surprise. Some of them galloped around distractedly, shrieking out meaningless orders. Regular soldiers supposedly left the battlefield to go guard the baggage train or to hang around in nearby bushes. Because general control lacked, many infantry units could not form up in squares, a traditional defense against attacking cavalry. The Prussians made serious inroads in record time. Things were not looking good for the Russians. But to the south, Sibylski's cavalry managed to form a battle line against Holstein's advancing cavalry. Still, Holstein's dragoons launched a severe charge and burst through the enemy lines. Brutal fighting broke out. And to the north, despite the initial surprising casualties, the Russians held Schorlemer's cavalry at bay. However, this promising position for the Russians was radically altered when Firmer ordered the advanced batteries in the north to retreat. There's no satisfactory explanation for why he gave this order, but it directly freed up Schorlemer's 30 cavalry squadrons. These cavalry squadrons now flung themselves at Firmer's cavalry despite the artillery battering. Casualties mounted. To their south, the Prussian infantry continued making inroads against the Russians. Fighting slowly moved into the Norrkitten Wald, but despite the Prussian discipline and their advantage of surprise, it gradually became evident reserves plugged the holes with relative ease. This also became noticeable to the south. Holstein's dragoons lost 55 men. Despite inflicting many more casualties, it put them on the back foot. The other cavalry units too lost significant numbers, sometimes up to half their strength. They battered the Russians, but their numerical disadvantage showed. Meanwhile, nearby Nordkitten, General Pyotr Rumyantsev managed to rally his infantry. Using them as reserves, they charged through the forest against the Prussian infantry. The combat slowly began moving in the opposite direction, outside the woods. The Russians returned fire perhaps a fraction of the time, but the volume of volleys still tore into the Prussian ranks. The battlefield was cluttered and chaotic thanks to artillery shelling from both sides. Eyewitness accounts mention blinding smoke. During the skirmish, a Prussian regiment accidentally fired into its front lines. Many men were lost. Then on the south, the Russian cavalry seemingly broke. They were routed, and Holstein's dragoons chased them using the momentum. Would Prussia finally break through? Well, certainly not in the way they expected. It was all a ruse. The Cossacks feigned retreat as Holstein's dragoons chased and passed Uzbunsen. Suddenly they ran into Sibylski's heavy guns. They mauled the Prussian cavalry, and as the Russian infantry closed off their only escape, they surrendered. They were captured almost to a man. This happened around 6 a.m. Fighting continued until approximately 7 a.m. The battle lines remained somewhat the same. The decisive combats occurred around the center where the Prussian infantry and Russians heavily clashed. Still, despite causing many more casualties, the holes were plugged with reserves. For example, an infantry unit broke through the Russian ranks but lost 489 men and 16 officers. Because of the lack of follow-up, the heavily battered unit had to pull back again. As more Russians began forming up and resisting the Prussians, Leyvold understood further attacks would disproportionately affect his men, so he ordered the general retreat. In total, the Prussians suffered between 5,000 and 6,000 casualties. Sources indicate 1,452 dead and 4,502 wounded, although the number of wounded soldiers seems to be inflated. Among them were 282 officers. They also lost 17 battalion guns and 11 big guns. The Russians suffered between 5,000 and 7,000 casualties, at least 1,818 dead and 2,800 wounded. Among them were 11 generals, a surprisingly high number.
I think it is worth briefly reflecting on the battle and its implications. First, the Prussians managed to closely contest an army twice their size. They surprised the entire army, and initially it seemed like they would emerge victoriously. But we should also not forget that the Russians still managed to come out on top, despite a surprise attack, fundamental lack of discipline, and an absence of drilling. Sure, their numerical superiority played an essential part in the eventual victory, but still, they had no opportunity to form conventional battle lines, for example. Redman explains how the Europeans did not know much about Russian warfare at this time. Besides Sweden wars the previous century, their next best source were the Ottomans, which did not exactly provide the average European commander with much knowledge. Simply put, the Prussians had no idea what to expect, and they misjudged Russian tenacity. This is something that caught me personally somewhat by surprise, but it makes total sense. During the early and middle 18th century, there indeed must have been an absence of knowledge about the Russian warfare and army and their battle tactics. As for Gross-Jägersdorf's aftermath, For the Russians, the most logical course of action would be to continue for 50 more kilometers and seize Königgrätz, the duchy's capital. This move would certainly amputate one of Prussia's safeguards, and it would open the way to its heartland. However, the opposite happened. It was a blessing for Frederick, one that is inexplicable. There would be several more of these strange, inexplicable events during the entire war. Because whether it was because of a false report of the death of the Tsarina, the complete lack of supply lines, local uprisings against the marauding Russians, or an epidemic of smallpox among his soldiers, all that we know is that Apraxin did not follow up his victory. After the victory of Gross-Jägersdorf, the Russians retreated from the duchy. Unfortunately for Apraxin, the Tsarina had not passed away. When she learned of his rather random retreat, she relieved him from command and investigated the Chancellor, supposedly supporting the retreat, for treason. As a result, the Chancellor, Alexei Bestujev-Ryumin, was exiled to his estates. The Tsarina appointed the new Russian commander, William Fermor. This new commander would give Prussia much more of a run for its money, and as the other parties of the war learned of Prussia's defeat, things began heating up in Central Europe. The 18th century was not known for its rapid communication. During the 7 Years' War, this was no different. By early September, Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, was still oblivious to Field Marshal Hans von Lewald's defeat at the Battle of Gross-Jägersdorf over a week earlier. In fact, the spirits in the Prussian camp are described as being pretty optimistic during this time. But the war was dragging on, and frankly, Prussia's position was anything but to be happy about. At this stage of the war, there were roughly 3 fronts Prussia had to consider. The Russians were a source for worry in the east. Although, frankly, after Gross-Jägersdorf, they did not follow up their victory and left the Duchy of Prussia alone. To the south, the Austrians pestered the Silesian and Saxon frontiers. And to the west, the French and Imperial Army were becoming a major worry for the Prussian king. In July at Hastenbeck, the Duke of Cumberland suffered a defeat against the French army. This freed the French and Imperial Army to link up and move against Prussia's western border. As for the Saxon-Silesian front, we left it right after Prussia's defeat at Landeshut in early August. The door to Silesia was left wide open. The strategic situation was roughly as follows. Habsburg commanders Nadashti, Beck and Arenberg, among many others, roamed the Silesian frontier. The Duke of Brunswick-Bevern, assisted by General Winterfeld, held the gateways to Silesia with some 40,000 soldiers around Görlitz. He was to report any severe incursions against the Silesian territory as soon as they happened. To the west, the defeat at Hastenbeck led to negotiations between France and Hanover. These negotiations would eventually result in the Convention of Klosterzeven, leading to Hanover's withdrawal from the war and partial occupation by France. The convention wasn't signed until September 10, but by late August the writing was already on the wall. At Dresden, Frederick, Keith and Moritz planned accordingly. Since their Hanoverian allies would soon be of no use, they prepared for a march against the combined French Imperial Army in the west. If that army linked up with the Austrians, it would all be over. This was their only hope, to save Prussia's western flank, and with it, its existence. They commanded some 25,000 soldiers, a vastly inferior number to the French Imperial armies. In Bohemia to the east, besides the commanders of irregulars, Field Marshal Daun commanded around 75,000 soldiers. Being a notoriously cautious and patient commander, he mainly roamed around in friendly territory, attempting to find an opening into the Silesian heartland. For weeks, skirmishes continued along the entire frontier, but none of them proved decisive, nor did any of them seduce the other side to engage in a large-scale battle. Not for a lack of trying on Prussia's side, by the way, but the Austrian commanders understood they enjoyed a numerical and supply superiority. Time was on their side. There was no reason to engage in a major battle. For example, the Austrian army was firmly entrenched in Zittau. There was no reason for them to move, and for Prussia it was impossible to launch any type of assault. As they sustained constant harassment by irregulars, the relationship between Bevern and Winterfeld was nothing to write home about. Frederick purposefully left Winterfeld together with Bevern as the aging duke did not have the king's complete confidence. This dynamic caused embarrassment for Bevern and annoyance for Winterfeld, who did not like the fact his superior impeded his autonomy. The Prussian army was roughly split in two with this dynamic in mind. Bevern commanded 30,000 soldiers holding the strategically well-fortified Görlitz. Winterfeld commanded some 10,000 soldiers on the right bank of the Neisse River, nearby Moys. They were close to each other, very close, but they were still separate. In Vienna, the lack of initiative by Prince Charles and Dawn rubbed Maria Theresa the wrong way ever since the war had broken out. In late August, she sent one of her many letters to Prince Charles, goading him into action. He had to retake Silesia, especially now that Frederick was preoccupied in the west. Unbeknownst to her, recent developments highly played in their favor. It spurred Charles to take action finally. Nadashti seized a strategic position near Seidenberg, close to Winterfeld's encampment. The time was right not just to enter Silesia, but hopefully seize the entire province and push through Saxony and perhaps even Brandenburg. If done correctly, they could decapitate Prussia. They could, at least, sever its limbs. On the morning of September 7, Prince Charles ordered Nadashti to move into Silesia along the right bank of the Neisse. Dawn, commanding the main Austrian army, followed him closely in case things went wrong. To the west of the Neisse lay Görlitz, where most of the Prussian army, some 30,000 soldiers, camped. A wooden bridge over the Neisse connected Görlitz and Moys. At Moys, Winterfeld's 10,000-strong corps camped. On the morning of September 7, Nadashti reached the vicinity of Moys. He commanded between 20 and 26,000 soldiers, including artillery. 5,000 of them were cavalry, and a few thousand were irregulars, mainly Croats and Hungarians. Winterfeld's soldiers were outnumbered at least 2-1. The Austrians swiftly expelled some outposts at Hermsdorf and Leopoldshain. That morning, Winterfeld was absent. He likely was in a meeting with Bevern across the Neisse. The fact the commander was absent, as the Prussian scouts noticed Nadashti's numerous army approach from the southeast, could have impeded the deployment stages of many armies with a centralized command structure at the time. But thanks to Frederick's military reforms, many Prussian units acted autonomously. When the scouts warned them of the approaching army, they took their positions accordingly. General von Zieten commanded the left wing of the Prussian army, consisting of 35 squadrons of cavalry and 8 battalions of infantry. 2,000 Prussian grenadiers stood on the slope of the Jakobsberg in front of Moys, to the southeast of the main army. The remainder of the army was positioned on Moys' outskirts. The Austrians divided their army in two parts. On the right, they occupied Hermsdorf and Leopoldshain. The left, commanded by Arenberg, preyed on the Jakobsberg. To the south of Moys, 2 Hussar regiments roamed around looking for an opening. Nadashti's order to open artillery fire from the hill north of Tilitz marked the start of the battle. At 6 a.m., an enormous bombardment erupted. After briefly battering the Prussian lines, the Duke of Arenberg launched his attack. Commanding 6 companies, they marched uphill through the plain against the Prussians, who were hastily taking their positions. Additionally, some 1,000 Croat irregulars joined the advance. They stormed the Jakobsberg. The Prussians and Austrians heavily clashed on the slopes of the hill. Despite their numerical inferiority, Prussian tenacity initially showed. The Austrians, scaling slopes, engaged in heavy close combat with the Prussians. These managed to maintain control of the battlefield and halt the Austrian advance. Firing their characteristic volleys, they tore into the Austrian lines, inflicting significant casualties. When the smoke cleared, the first wave of Austrians retreated. The attack was repelled. For now, Winterfeld heard noise
of battle from a distance. Around this time, he likely also learned the Prussians' outposts had been expelled by a much larger force. He deduced this wasn't just a slight skirmish, but in fact a major assault. So he rallied as many men as he could, and with some 5 battalions he returned to Moys. Nadashti ordered a renewed assault, this time with more soldiers. Significantly outnumbering the Prussians, the Austrians moved forward against the Prussian vanguard. Duke Arenberg, on the left, again launched an attack against the Jakobsberg. The remainder of the infantry marched against the Langeberg in front of Moys. The Prussians on the Langeberg launched volley after volley. The artillery tore up the Austrian lines, but around the Jakobsberg, slowly the Austrians pushed the Prussians up the mountain. This continued until Arenberg's vanguard reached the outskirts of Moys. Around this time Winterfeld arrived. He found a scattered and cluttered battlefield, chaotic, with his troops pushed back by the much more numerous Austrians. On the Landberg, savage hand-to-hand combat erupted. Whereas the Austrians initially enjoyed an advantage, now Winterfeld's fresh battalions pushed back the attack. But their advantage was short-lived. Nadashti urged on the attack, and 22 additional cavalry squadrons and infantry joined the fight. Winterfeld understood he didn't stand a chance against the numerically superior army. Messengers rushed to and fro Bevern's camp requesting reinforcements, but these reinforcements never arrived. Combat continued for about an hour, but it was clear the Austrians were pushing into the Prussian lines. During a counterattack, Winterfeld was struck by a bullet in his spine. Eyewitness accounts reveal Winterfeld spent his last moments alive, giving orders to his subordinates. He remained conscious until the end. After a few hours of heavy, close-quarter combat, Nadashti finally enjoyed part of his vanguard in a strategic position on the rises. He used his numerical superiority. Part of his army managed to circumvent the Prussians around the Jakobsberg. They attacked the Prussian lines from the flank. Zieten attempted to mount a relief effort, but Nadashti held enough reserves to quickly nip this in the bud. At around 1:30 p.m., the Prussians began the retreat over the bridge towards Görlitz. By this time, the severity of the situation dawned on the commanders there. Prussian batteries across the Neisse ensured the Austrians couldn't pursue the retreating Prussians. Then again, the Austrians didn't want to. They were more than happy with their victory. The Battle of Moys is a footnote of the 7 Years' War, but the casualties and especially the subsequent events tell another story. The Prussians lost some 2,000 men, with severe losses among several battalions. The 41st Infantry defending the Jakobsberg, for example, lost 204 dead and 68 wounded by the end of the battle. The 21st Infantry lost 376 men. Among the casualties were 51 officers and General Winterfeld. Meanwhile, the Austrians suffered around 1,500 casualties, both killed and wounded, 79 officers, around 1,300 wounded, and 200 dead or missing.
It is briefly worth reflecting on why Bevern didn't send any reinforcements to support Winterfeld. Redman rightly argues that the personal animosity between the commanders is not enough reason. It indeed isn't. Perhaps Bevern wrongly believed Winterfeld was winning the battle, or that the situation wasn't as serious as it actually was. Credible primary sources did not survive the test of time, if they ever existed at all. All that is known is that there's no denying more could have been done to save Winterfeld's army. Now, bad news quickly followed each other up. So firstly, Frederick learned of Lewald's defeat at Gross-Jägersdorf. That same day, the Convention of Klooster-Zeven was signed, confirming Hanover's withdrawal from the war. The same week, the Swedish army landed in Pomerania. But, perhaps most importantly, Bevern decided to retreat deeper into Silesia because of the defeat. During his retreat, irregulars commanded by General Beck harassed him along the way. Bevern's withdrawal would have far-reaching consequences for the course of the war. Frederick initially was none the wiser about Winterfeld's death. A letter from September 14, 1757 survives. In it, Frederick writes to Winterfeld, "Everything is going splendidly here, but I am very worried by a rumor which has come to me from Lusatia. I don't know what to make of it. They write me from Dresden that you have been killed, but from Berlin, that you received a minor cut in the shoulder." Frederick ended up learning the truth shortly thereafter. Winterfeld's death impacted him, much more so than Schwerin's. Duffy writes that toward the end of his life, he was discussing the Battle of Moys, when he burst out. "That was where Winterfeld was killed. He was a good man, a man of soul. He was my friend." His great eyes brimmed with tears as he looked towards the window. He opened the casement and stood there some time before he turned back to Reichel and sent him on his way with a perceptible softening in his voice. "Good night. I am obliged to you." As for Winterfeld's remains, they were returned to Prussia 2 days after the battle under the flag of a truce. The next few weeks, Bevern's army was chased by 90,000 Austrians, and in the west, trouble continued brewing as well. There was no end in sight for Prussia's war on multiple fronts. The next decisive moment would be the Battle of Rossbach, where Prussia's future and its existence would be decided. Late summer 1757, the initial campaigning of the 7 Years' War was over. It did not look good for Prussia's King Frederick the Great. Despite a promising start, the Prussian army and its Hanoverian ally lost multiple battles. Optimism crumbled as enemies encroached on Prussia's territory from the north, the south, the east and the west. All the while, the Prussian army suffered enormous losses. The king knew all too well what was at stake. The entire existence of his kingdom was hanging by a thread. In a final desperate maneuver, Frederick took part of his army outnumbered 2-1 against the combined French imperial army. If he lost, it would all be over. The subsequent events culminated in what Christopher Clark describes as Frederick the Great's single most impressive victory. The late summer months of 1757 held nothing but bad news for the Prussians. In early September, Frederick learned of Field Marshal Hans von Lewald's defeat at Gross-Jägersdorf, the subsequent defeat at the Battle of Moys, and the death of his cherished friend, General von Winterfeld, crushed the king. Bevern retreated to Breslau, where the Silesian front stagnated until November. 3 days after Moys, Hanover and France concluded the Convention of Klosterzeven. It led to Hanover's withdrawal from the war. It opened Prussia's western flank to a combined French imperial army commanded by Prince de Soubise and Prince Joseph Friedrich von Sachsen-Hildenburghausen. To the north, the Swedes, led by Baron Matthias von Ungern-Sternberg, finally landed in Stralsund on September 13, although the Baron was delayed by 4 weeks. Their navy blockaded Stettin, not an ideal position for Prussia, but intelligence told Frederick the Swedes weren't eager to conduct an invasion of Prussia's heartland. Instead, they conducted sieges against Pomerania's strongholds, and that was it. The Reichsarmee, the imperial army, wasn't the leading cause for worry either. Comprised of soldiers from many imperial states, 231 political bodies, every house sent its commanders, challenging to work together and heavily decentralized, with the field marshal maintaining feeble control. The army's efficiency is still debated. On August 30, Frederick arrived at Dresden. Here, Keith maintained a force of some 25,000 soldiers who retreated from Bohemia. These were in poor shape, battered by the constant harassment by irregulars and the elements wearing them down. Frankly, Prussia's army was so weakened that Frederick resorted to deceptive measures to prevent an all-out invasion. For example, the names of Prussian regiments were changed when they moved quarters to confuse enemy spies and inflate their numbers. The next few weeks saw Frederick move around in Saxony, attempting to force a battle against the roaming Princes Soubise and Hildburghausen. During this, Frederick learned of Winterfeld's death. He wrote to his sister that he was so oppressed with grief that he would rather keep his sadness to himself. He was looking forward to dying sword in hand rather than suffering defeat, followed by the tyrannical rule of his enemies. Sorrow is a century, death is an instant. Already after Kolin, Frederick considered suicide. He now proposed a mutual suicide pact to his sister. Fortunately for him, she reminded him that a great genius like yours finds resources even when all is lost, and it is impossible for this frenzy to continue. His subordinates did not notice Frederick's depression and suicidal tendencies. Aside from the outpouring of letters to his sister, he resolutely conducted his campaign with steadfastness and calm. And fortune sometimes does work in mysterious ways. Around this time, Frederick learned of Apráxin's withdrawal from the Duchy of Prussia, despite the Russian victory at Gross-Jägersdorf. He immediately congratulated Lewald and ordered him to return to Pomerania to defend it against the Swedes. To a contemporary observer, this would not be enough to reinvigorate Prussia. To illustrate the threat the kingdom's existence hung by, on October 16, a 3,400-strong Austrian flying corps under General Hadik managed to raid Berlin. They faced barely any opposition. Clearly unable to hold the city, they demanded a hefty ransom before leaving the next day. This news was met by Frederick splitting up his army, dispatching Moritz to relieve the capital before moving in that direction. Keith maintained the western frontier, but due to the slow communication at the time, Frederick learned of Hadik's departure 3 days too late, so he turned his army around, returning to Torgau. Moving like this did not exactly improve the army's morale. The soldiers are greatly fatigued, as it has rained constantly since we left Dresden, and the roads are extremely bad. Many of the Saxons incorporated into the Prussian troops have deserted, but this is no real loss. Frederick still assessed Prussia's survival depended on him preventing the French Imperial and Austrian armies from linking up. From Leipzig, Keith reported the French Imperial army linked up nearby them at Mücheln. This was his chance. He rallied his army at Leipzig. Conducting any campaign with this army would be tough, even for the greatest of commanders. To illustrate, Moritz's army had just 5 days to march from Berlin, and Ferdinand's army just 3 from Magdeburg. However, sources reveal what is the most surprising and pleasing at the same time is the spirit the soldiers showed on this occasion. They had marched upwards of 25 English miles a day for 3 or 5 days successively, and at the moment they arrived, they desired to be led into battle against the enemy. Frederick could not pinpoint the exact location of the enemy, but prepared his army for an inevitable battle. On November 3rd, Frederick arrived at Weissenfels. A letter he wrote reveals, "The enemy is assembling troops opposite of me. From my window I can see all his cavalry. The enemy saw him as well." Frederick in person was at the riverbank watching with some frustration as the French burned the covered wooden bridge behind them. 2 enemy officers were watching the royal party from a concealed position on an island which lay within close musket shot range. One of the Frenchmen hastened back to report that it would be possible for a marksman to shoot down a Prussian senior officer, and that this dignitary was probably the king from the respect that was being shown to him. Crillon handed his loyal Brunet a glass of wine and sent him back to his post, remarking that he and his comrades had been put there to observe whether the bridge was burning properly, and not to kill a general who was making reconnaissance, let alone the sacred person of a king, which must always be held in reverence. False intelligence led Frederick to believe his enemy numbered 60,000, outnumbering his force nearly 3-1. This was exaggerated, but the fact Frederick continued to pry for battle just shows how desperate or how confident he was.
In reality, the Prussians found themselves outnumbered around 2-1 by the combined French Imperial Army. The numbers of soldiers participating in the battle are relatively well documented. The Prussians commanded some 16,600 infantry in 20-some battalions, and 5,400 cavalry in between 32 and 45 squadrons, 22,000 men in total, with 79 pieces of artillery. The French Imperial Army commanded 33,770 infantry in 49 battalions and 7,340 cavalry in 40 squadrons, for a total of 41,110 men. They fielded 114 artillery pieces. Of those, 10,900 troops and 45 guns were from the Imperial Army. Frederick positioned his army between the villages of Bedrath and Rossbach, some 4 miles removed from where he assumed the French were stationed. The musicians in the French camp revealed their location. All their complements of musicians, trumpeters, drummers, and fifers now gave sound, as if they had won some great victory. Frederick set up headquarters at Rossbach. His brother-in-law, the Duke of Brunswick, commanded the right wing. General von Seydlitz commanded the cavalry. Preceding the battle, a crucial miscalculation in the French camp occurred. Their scouts relayed the Prussians were outnumbered and were likely to flee, whereas Prince de Soubise still wanted to proceed with caution. Prince Joseph Friedrich persuaded him to attack the following day. Meanwhile, in the Prussian camp, Frederick miscalculated as well, but in a more favorable way than his opponents. He figured his enemies were about to retreat and viewed their movements accordingly. The following moment, the French Imperial Army moved to the south in 3 columns. They hoped to outflank the numerically inferior army on their left. The columns moved slow and sluggish, with the French cavalry far in advance. The Count of Saint-Germain and Ernst Gideon von Loudon protected the rear, positioned on the hills south of Mückelen. But this movement only strengthened Frederick's belief they were attempting to retreat. Only when the French turned to the east did he reconsider his assessment. Perhaps they were trying to flank his army. He rapidly switched gears, understanding the gravity of the situation if he allowed his enemies to complete their maneuver. Frederick redeployed his army with incredible speed. First, he dispatched his cavalry under General von Seydlitz. Then he ordered Prince Henry and Ferdinand to lead all his infantry from their positions to the southeast and take a position in front of Reichenberg and Tagewerben. The cavalry moved to the east past the Janusberg before bending south. The long ridge masked their movements. During this move, the Prussian artillery hastened to deploy on top of the Janusberg. Seydlitz appeared in front of the Imperial cavalry, charging them head-on. Both parties clashed and savage combat ensued. During this charge, the Prussians didn't enjoy much momentum, and the French cavalry soon moved to aid their Imperial comrades. Then the artillery lit up the valley. A deafening bombardment followed, mauling several infantry units. With the arrival of the French cavalry, Seydlitz called in his reserves. These charged head-on against a body of cavalry. Savage close-quarter combat followed. This time, the Prussians enjoyed more success. Their enemy's cavalry began crumbling. They were pushed past Reichenberg. Around this time, the Prussian infantry vanguard arrived at their destination. The acute angle they positioned themselves in formed the perfect trap for the advancing enemy. Already suffering heavy bombardments, they ran into an awful sight. The cavalry was mauled to their south. In front of them, the Prussians trapped them. Upon their arrival, the Prussians launched an obliterating volley. Heavily demoralized, part of the infantry barely resisted. The volleys shredded the front lines. Some of the Imperial infantry dropped their weapons and ran. The French infantry launched a few scattered volleys, but the Prussians did not stop. Because of their formation in columns, the return fire was wildly ineffective. As the Prussians advanced, the infantry vanguard engaged in ferocious close combat, while large parts of the column deteriorated in an uncontrollable frenzy. It has to be said that Prince Joseph of Saxe-Hildburghausen, despite being wounded, personally led a bayonet charge, a futile attempt, but it evoked even Soubise's admiration. As the first fights erupted between infantry, Seydlitz completed the rout of the French Imperial Cavalry. His horsemen were ideally positioned to the south of the infantry skirmish. He did not order his cavalry to launch a pursuit against the fleeing cavalry. Instead, he ordered the devastating charge into the right flank of the French infantry. As the French were being massacred, the total collapse of the column followed. Within minutes, the column cracked entirely and the infantry retreated towards Pettstadt. A French soldier participating in the battle later described the retreat. Everybody sank into a mob. It was not possible to prevent the flight. The Prussian infantry followed on our heels and fired without checking its advance or having a man drop out of rank or file. The artillery bombarded us without pause. It was only thanks to darkness arriving at 5 p.m. that the slaughter wasn't worse than it already was. In total, the Prussians lost no more than 550 men, of whom 170 were killed. 1 colonel and 7 officers were among the dead. 23 officers and 356 men were wounded. In contrast, the French Imperial Army lost over 10,000 men. Most of them were captured as prisoners. Of those casualties, the French lost some 6,600 men and the Rijksarmee lost 3,552. Among the prisoners were 8 to 11 French generals, depending on the source, 260 officers, and 6,000 soldiers. Among the spoils were 22 standards and colors. The majority of the casualties were French, although the Imperials certainly received a battering. In total, they lost 72 guns, 21 standards, and the bulk of their baggage. The victory was quick, to the degree that most Prussian infantry never even discharged their weapons. Christopher Clark remarks the Battle of Rossbach as Frederick the Great's single most impressive victory. It lasted only 90 minutes but decided the future of the Kingdom of Prussia. That night, Frederick wanted to lodge in the nearby castle of Burgwerben, only to find it was filled with injured French officers. So instead, he lodged in a servant's room in the village. Clark writes, "In France, the alliance with Austria and especially the abject defeat at Rossbach played disastrously with the home public, raising doubts about the competence of the Bourbon regime that would preserve until the revolutionary crisis of the 1780s. A letter by the French foreign minister, Cardinal de Bernis, observes, "More than ever before, our nation is outraged against the war. Our enemy, the King of Prussia, is loved to the point of distraction, but the court of Vienna is hated because it is seen as a bloodsucker of the state." One day after the battle, Frederick wrote to his sister, "That was a tame battle. I can go to my grave in peace because the reputation and honor of my people have been saved. We may still be overtaken by misfortune, but we will never be disgraced." Perhaps the battle indeed was tame to him, but it did change the fortune of his kingdom. Whereas everything had gone wrong for Frederick at Kolin, everything went right at Rossbach. The Prussian army and Frederick the Great's reputation were vindicated. There is an important caveat when considering this comparison. Blenning writes, "A major difference, of course, lay in the relative caliber of Frederick's opponents. At Kolin, he had faced battle-hardened Austrians supported by Saxons seeking revenge for the humiliations inflicted on them by the Prussians during the Second Silesian War. At Rossbach, the French were exhausted after a long march across Germany and disorganized by the persistent looting for which they had become notorious. Even the French commanders were demoralized. A surviving letter by the Count of Saint-Germain does not leave much unsaid. No doubt, you, like me, were able to predict the Rossbach disaster 5 months ago. Never has there been such a defective army, and the first cannon shot determined our route and humiliation. I am leading a gang of robbers, of murderers fit only for the gallows, who run away at the sound of the first gunshot, and who are always ready to mutiny. The king has the worst infantry under the sun, and the worst disciplined. There is just nothing to be done with troops such as these." Rossbach meant Frederick and the Kingdom of Prussia would live to see another day, but to the east, trouble was brewing. As Frederick soon ordered his victorious but tired army on a grueling march to the east. There, exactly 1 month after Rossbach, he would meet the Austrian army at Leuthen. Again, he would be heavily outnumbered. And again, it would be a battle determining the future of Prussia. In the aftermath of Frederick the Great's impressive victory at Rossbach, the dynamics of the war changed significantly. Things were finally looking up for Prussia, although their position was far from safe. The French retreat at Rossbach was marked, according to Fraser, by more than a customary atrocity. Destruction was indiscriminate. Churches and altars were defiled. The country, people treated deplorably. Despite this, Frederick could not shake the uneasy feeling of defeating his former allies. "I can never get used to looking on the French as my enemies." Rossbach at best allowed Frederick to focus on other dangers, mainly the Austrians. Frederick knew this. He later wrote, "Strictly speaking,
The Battle of Rossbach merely afforded me the freedom to go in search of new dangers in Silesia. Upon his success, Frederick's cousin, King George II of England, reconsidered the Peace of Klosterzeven and rejoined the war on Prussia's side. His son, the Duke of Cumberland, had been a disappointment. Frederick knew just the man for the job. Frederick's brother-in-law, Ferdinand, Duke of Brunswick, took over. His British-financed army would control the Western Front, fighting several iconic battles. So the Western, Northern and Eastern fronts of the war were relatively under control, for now. But that did not mean Frederick was free of worry. The Austrians were dead set on crushing the Prussian army in Silesia. Silesia lay more or less open for them after the Austrian victory at the Battle of Moys. Sure, Bevern fought all the way during his retreat, but heavily outnumbered, there was not much he could do. His retreat sacrificed strong points of defense. As Charles pursued Bevern with a characteristic Austrian sluggishness, he dispatched a 12,000-strong force under Ernst Dietrich Breyer von Marschall. He held Lusatia, protecting the flank of the Austrians moving into Silesia. One day after his victory at Rossbach, Frederick collected his tired and his worn-down army, likely no more than 15,000 men. A grueling march lay before them. Autumn and early winter were an unusual time for a campaign such as this one, but for now, the mild weather assisted him. Prince Henry maintained Leipzig, and Keith took an army of equal size to make a feint attack against Prague and hopefully split up the Austrian army. We have to briefly look more in depth at the Austrian operations in Bohemia, Silesia and Saxony the month before Rossbach. Already in October, worrying information reached Frederick. Early that month, General Nadashti laid siege to the iconic fortress of Schweidnitz with some 43,000 soldiers and plenty of big guns. Bevern did manage to successfully pull back to Breslau. However, Breslau was in a very poor shape. Its population wasn't pro-Prussian and its walls and defenses were crumbling. Bevern decided to entrench his army in the southern suburbs of the city. All this happened in early October, but as we have come to know the Austrian campaigning, it stagnated thanks to the slow decision-making. This window provided Bevern with a very welcome opportunity to prepare for the approaching battle. As for Schweidnitz, the fortress held out against multiple assaults and continuous bombardments for over a month. They did not surrender until November 12, after inflicting heavy casualties against the Austrians. But the fortress was reduced to mostly rubble. The Austrians won. They captured 180 guns, 48 colors, 333,600 thalers, 2 months' worth of rations, and nearly 6,000 prisoners, among them 4 generals and nearly 200 officers. The Austrians lost 3,000 men, of whom 1,200 killed. This opened the road to Breslau, and it freed Nadashti's troops. They joined Prince Charles's army, which now numbered over 80,000 men. When news of Schweidnitz's capitulation reached Frederick, he was livid. He wrote Bevern he blamed him personally for the loss of the fortress since he didn't mount a relief effort. If Bevern and Generals Friedrich Kiau and Johann Lestwitz continued to act like old hogs, they would answer with their heads, as would all other generals who allowed themselves to be ruled by cowardice and weakness. Meanwhile, word of Frederick's victory at Rossbach reached the Austrian camp. They realized the Prussian king would surely attempt to thwart their advance. Prince Charles did not feel like fighting in front of Breslau, but Maria Theresa and Dawn overruled him. When Frederick arrived at his quarters close by, heavy bombardment and gunfire were audible. He didn't know it yet, but later learned the Austrians stormed Bevern's camp in what became the Battle of Breslau.
The Battle of Breslau was quite a muddled affair with multiple fronts going on. Prince Charles commanded up to 85,000 soldiers, at least 60,381 infantry in 96 battalions, 93 grenadier companies, and 23,220 cavalry in 141 squadrons. Additionally, he fielded 228 artillery pieces. In contrast, Bevern commanded between 21 and 28,400 troops, 40 battalions, and 102 squadrons. The Prussians were significantly outnumbered. However, the Oder and Lohe provided impossible defenses. Bevern positioned the Prussian army between Kosel in the north and Gräbchen in the south. His lines extended to Neudorf in the east. His army was snugly entrenched with infantry defending strategic villages. He hoped it would make up for his numerical inferiority. Zieten held the Prussian left between Grieten and Kleinburg. Lieutenant General von Lestwitz commanded infantry at Höfgen. The Prussians erected defenses south of Gräbchen and Gabitz. The battle was preceded by 2 days of heavy artillery shelling from both sides. The Austrians, mauled by heavy fire, installed 7 pontoon bridges across the Lohe, 3 northwest of Schmeidfeld, and 4 southeast of Kleinmückberg. In the early morning of November 22, the Austrians finished deploying from Massowitz all the way to Hartlieb. The cavalry followed the infantry, Charles on the left, Nadashti on the right. The reserves under General Witt deployed behind Gross-Mückbern. The battle commenced with Nadashti's 3 columns advancing across the pontoon bridges. He wanted to attack the entrenchments at Gabitz. Meanwhile, to the far north, Beck advanced from the northwest. He quickly expelled a minor Prussian force holding Ostwitz. Then he installed 3 artillery pieces on the banks of the Oder, launching volleys for the remainder of the day. The Duke of Bevern did not believe Charles's main attack would be across his western flank, reinforcing Zieten's flank. Nadashti's grenadiers launched an attack against Kleinburg. Neither commander dared to commit their full force. The outnumbered Prussian battalion defended the village with vigor. Battle continued for a while, but they ended up yielding the village and took their positions to the north. When the infantry to the north launched a counterattack, the Austrians fled the village. Zieten's hussars chased the fleeing Austrians. Nadashti ordered his entire army to retreat to their original positions. As the status quo returned, Zieten relayed to Bevern how Nadashti's sizable force would surely attempt another counterattack. In the event, Nadashti would not, but for the remainder of the battle, Zieten and Nadashti remained face to face, not engaging in combat. This was especially bad for the Prussians, as it hogged valuable manpower. To the west, the fighting was much more intense. Right after noon, the entire Austrian army, including reserves, began their march across the pontoon bridges. Additionally, some light infantry and 1,000 regular infantry crossed the dense Pilsnitz forest from the north to launch an attack against the Prussian right flank. The army crossing the bridge at Gross-Mückbern rapidly advanced. They faced fierce resistance at Kleinmückberg and suffered an infantry charge between Kleinmückberg and Grabchen. Lieutenant General Pennever led his cuirassier brigade against the Austrian infantry. Sustaining heavy casualties, they barely inflicted any damage. During the charge, Pennever was mortally wounded. By this time, the Austrians seized the abandoned trenches, installing their artillery there. Shortly thereafter, the entire Prussian infantry was evicted from the villages, and the Austrians took over. The infantry began their retreat towards the entrenchments near Gabitz. Bevern ordered several cavalry squadrons to launch another cavalry charge against the Austrian grenadiers holding Gräbchen. But thanks to additional reinforcements, the cavalry was easily repelled. Lestwitz's left flank was threatened by the Austrians holding these villages. As combat continued between Kleinmückbern and Gräbchen, Macquarie and Arenberg had crossed the Lohe from Neukirch towards Schmiedfeld. Because they were exposed to the Prussian artillery, they suffered many more casualties, but their attack against the entrenchments around Schmiedfeld favored them. Heavy combat commenced, as the Prussians reportedly resisted until all ammunition was expended. Reinforcements sent by Lestwitz could not change the course of the battle. Near Höfgen, Witt launched a frontal charge against the weakening infantry. They resisted until the Austrians around Kleinmückbern were close to circling around them. The assault in the north focused beyond Pilsnitz. Gau and Lestwitz desperately defended the crossing against overwhelming numbers, not to mention the increasing danger of flanking from the south. The marshy and uneven terrain, in combination with accurate Prussian artillery shelling, saw Austrian casualties mount. Supported by cavalry, the infantry launched 3 charges against the redoubts around Pilsnitz. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but each time, the Austrians were driven back. To their north, the Prussian Feldjäger engaged in guerrilla-like warfare against the Austrian Grenzers trekking through the Pilsnitz forest. These skirmishes continued throughout the day but saw no fruitful incursions by the Austrians. As the sun began setting at 5:30 p.m., the Austrians launched their fourth assault. This time, it proved successful. The Prussian infantry retreated, and the Austrians rapidly seized the strongpoints, but could not continue past the trenches dug behind them. They didn't want to anyway. It was getting too dark. Behind the front lines throughout the day, Bevern had scrambled to collect forces and launch a counterattack. He decided Wiet's Reserve Corps was the most viable target. At around 6 p.m. he collected 14 battalions ready to launch an attack. When they launched against the Austrians at Schmidfeld, Höfgen and Kleinmückberg, heavy combat around the villages followed. The Prussian assault was only broken thanks to the intervention of Austrian cavalry on both flanks, threatening to cut them off. Klein-Gundau became Prussia's most forward base. No attempts were made to attempt and seize it. The armies fought for 15 hours that day. The front extended 11 kilometers. It can safely be said the Austrians had the upper hand, but the Prussians sure fiercely resisted, despite being outnumbered nearly 3-1. Only Zieten's wing maintained its original positions, thanks to Nadashti's inaction. It is unclear what happened that night. Some sources indicate Bevern wanted to launch a counterattack the following morning. Other sources indicate he ordered the general retreat. All that is for sure is that during nighttime, in utter silence, the Prussian army began its retreat via Breslau across the Oder. General Lestwitz and 10 battalions remained behind to defend Breslau against the inevitable siege. The casualties were significant. The Prussians lost 6,350 men, at least 800 killed, among whom 1 general and 150 officers. 3 generals were mortally wounded. Another 3,800 men deserted, and some 700 were captured. In total, the Austrian casualties numbered some 5,800. 649 soldiers and 44 officers were killed. 235 officers and 4,464 men were wounded. Another 460 went missing. They lost 1 general and 6 wounded.
The way the Battle of Breslau ended was perhaps a bit sudden and definitely wasn't a traditional victory or defeat. The retreat, though arguably understandable, did not sit well with Frederick. The Prussian king was close to the battle after all. Bevern certainly felt his wrath. It just so happened, as he retreated, Bevern received the king's opinion on the fall of Schweidnitz. He could guess the king's response to his retreat from Breslau. That night, Bevern stumbled upon an Austrian outpost. He supposedly mistook it for a Prussian outpost and allowed himself to be captured. It is generally believed this was done on purpose in order to avoid the likely capital punishment Frederick threatened him with. Bevern was eventually taken to Vienna, and after 1 year he was later released without asking for ransom, thanks to his family ties to the royal family. Upon his return to Prussia, Frederick appointed him as governor of Stettin, but not before again fighting on the Prussian side, though the king continued to despise him. The capture of Breslau added another one, and frankly the final, Silesian stronghold to the Austrian tally. They controlled the province now. To the west, Frederick commanded an army outnumbered at least 3-1, just like at Rossbach. The future of his kingdom depended on what happened next. Against all rules of warfare, Frederick decided to seek the confrontation with the much larger army. It culminated in the legendary Battle of Leuthen.
The enemy holds the same entrenched camp of Breslau which my troops defended so honorably. I am marching to attack this position. The decisive moment is approaching. Contrary to every rule of art, I shall attack the army under the command of Prince Charles, even though it be 3 times my own strength, wherever and whenever I may meet it. The number of the foe, the strength of their position, are here matters of but secondary importance. All these must yield, I feel confident, before the unflinching bravery of my troops and the judicious execution of my orders. I must venture on this step, or all is lost. I fully recognize the dangers attached to this enterprise, but in my present situation, I must conquer or die. If we go under, all is lost.
In late November, dispatches reached Frederick of the Duke of Bevern's retreat after the Battle of Breslau. Frederick was livid, and he ordered Bevern to relieve the city, or to face capital punishment. Within 3 days, the remaining garrison surrendered Breslau, and Frederick learned the Austrians captured Bevern. All major Silesian strongholds, his exquisite defense against any invasion from the south, were in Austrian hands. Describing the situation as serious is an understatement. His army camped at Parchwitz for a week until December 4th. It became the central hub. Meanwhile, in the Austrian camp, Prince Charles learned of Frederick's position at Parchwitz. He figured, heavily outnumbering the Prussian king, this was the time to strike. Disregarding advice for caution, he wanted to strike at Frederick fast to prevent him from fortifying his position. He sent the army's bake ovens and a small corps ahead. Espray writes that Charles did not even consider the possibility of Frederick attacking him. On December 2nd, Zieten's column of demoralized soldiers arrived at Parchwitz. The Prussian army numbered some 33,000, many of them battered, worn down, and tired. Of course, the army's morale was strengthened by the soldiers' tales who fought at Rossbach, and Frederick's attitude towards his men certainly played a vital part. Frederick was never more close to his army than at Parchwitz. During these winter days, the king camped in the open air like one of his private soldiers. He used to warm himself at their fires and then make room for the others to take his place. He talked with the soldiers as if they were of his own kind. He sympathized with the travails which they had undergone, and in the most friendly possible way, he encouraged them to behave like heroes just once more. The constant desertions of forcibly enlisted Saxons and other uncommitted soldiers left Frederick with a loyal, battle-hardened force. On December 3rd, Frederick himself, approaching exhaustion, prepared for the assault against the Austrians. He promised his drained men wealth and promotion. He expected the Austrians to barricade themselves around Breslau, utilizing its strong natural fortifications. In the early morning of December 4th, the Prussian army departed. Skirmishes with Austrian hussars revealed the Austrian army was close, but nowhere to be seen. It wasn't until that evening Frederick learned the Austrians abandoned the stronghold around Breslau and they were within a day's marching distance. Frederick couldn't believe his luck. The plain they held was the same plain the Prussian army conducted its autumn war games. They knew it through and through.
That night, the Prussians camped weapon in hand without fire. It was freezing. In the distance, they saw the enemy's campfires. Frederick fielded around 12,000 cavalry in 128 squadrons, slightly under 23,000 infantry, and 160 artillery guns. At 4 a.m., the army awoke in silence and began their march in 2 infantry columns, flanked by cavalry on either side. Frederick rode among the vanguard with hussars and light Jaeger infantry. When the morning mist faded, a wide, open plain covered with light snow appeared. Frederick could likely name every village in the region, allowing him to give his subordinates clear instructions for deployment. Frederick reached the village of Born, where the Prussian cavalry engaged in a slight skirmish against Austrian and Saxon hussars. These were quickly routed, and 600 prisoners were taken. 3 infantry battalions held Born while Frederick climbed the Schönberg. Here, he saw the Austrian deployment, a vast line from north to south, spanning some 8 kilometers, faced him. The Austrians had just finished deploying. Earlier that morning, the Austrians were marching when news of Frederick's advance reached them. It caught them by surprise. 2 lines extended from Nipperen to the south of Leuthen. To the left rear, Nadashti manned the reserves. The Austrian army was significantly larger than Frederick expected. Prince Charles commanded between 65 and 70,000 troops. 5,000 of them were irregulars. The Prussian vanguards march towards Born led Charles to believe the Prussians would attack his right flank. This flank was protected by the Zettelbusch, the only extensively wooded area of the plain. Meanwhile, the Austrian left did not enjoy many natural defenses. In addition, the Sophienberg provided a perfect cover for his army to maneuver itself to the Austrian south unnoticed. For his plan to work, the Austrians had to be convinced he was attacking their well-defended right flank. He deployed 1 infantry and 1 cavalry unit in full view of the Austrians on the right. Charles saw these maneuvers and called 9 infantry battalions from the south to augment his right flank between Nipperen and Fröbelwitz. This was over an hour of hard marching away from the southern tip at Saarschütz. As the Austrian infantry moved from the south to the north, the exact opposite happened, behind the hill. It was past noon when the first Prussian columns reached Lobetins, removed from the Austrians' view. The columns swerved to their left, approaching the Austrian flank. Zieten rode far in advance towards the final line of march near the Schweidnitzer River. With the Prussian columns moving into their positions, Frederick rode towards Radaxdorf to observe the enemy. Prince Charles noticed the Prussian maneuver, but initially figured it was a diversion. He ordered the second line of infantry to break up and move to the south to augment the southernmost lines. These were held by German auxiliaries. The mobile Prussian artillery positioned itself on the Glanzberg. Around this time, Moritz of Anhalt-Dessau warned Frederick that in midwinter the days were very short, and it was already past noon. Frederick agreed, and he gave the order to attack. He warned all his regiments to advance slowly, leading to a textbook oblique order formation, with his right flank engaging in battle first. The German auxiliaries at Saarschütz received the brunt of the damage, putting up surprisingly fierce resistance. They realized they were outnumbered, and many on the left flank broke. Nadashti countered Zieten's charge, and fierce combat broke out to the south of Golau. Meanwhile, the Prussian artillery opened fire, tearing into the Austrian lines. Zieten's cavalry proved to be too strong, and Nadashti's cavalry broke. Charles realized he would not be able to remedy the southern flank with his reserves, so he ordered his entire army to bend to the south. The Austrians formed up in a line through Leuthen. Meanwhile, the mobile Prussian artillery deployed on the Butterberg and Judenberg, opening a devastating volley of fire against the Austrian lines. It was 3:30 p.m. when the second phase of the battle commenced. The Prussians launched a renewed assault against the newly formed Austrian line. The fiercest combat concentrated inside Leuthen, where savage door-to-door fighting broke out. Some Prussian battalions were beaten back, but the Prussian artillery compensated by opening a deafening barrage against the village. After half an hour of fighting, the Prussians seized a burning Leuthen. However, strong resistance behind the village continued. Then, the Austrian cavalry swerved down from the Austrian right. If successful, they could have easily turned the tide of the battle and crushed the Prussians from their left. But stationed nearby Radaxdorf, Lieutenant General Georg Wilhelm von Driessen commanded the reserve cavalry. Uncommitted and noticing the Austrian charge, he launched a countercharge. His cavalry clashed with the Austrian right flank. Heavy combat broke out as the Austrians attempted to find their footing. When it appeared the fighting would shift in the Austrian balance, the additional Prussian cavalry reserves came to Driessen's aid. The Austrian cavalry crumbled before the Prussian cavalry charged into the Austrian infantry lines north of Leuthen. Entire battalions threw their weapons away and fled, or surrendered. Any soldier who attempted to make a stand, was overrun by his comrades fleeing for their lives. The entire Austrian army collapsed into a rout. Riessen's cavalry provided the nail in the Austrian army's coffin. Against the odds, Prussia emerged victoriously. Darkness soon set in, and the surviving Austrians fled towards the Bohemian hills. In total, the Prussians suffered 6,382 casualties, about 1,200 dead, and the remainder wounded. The Austrians lost 22,000 men. Over 12,000 were captured, over 3,000 dead, and 6,000 to 7,000 wounded. 17 generals were among the dead and wounded, and 116 pieces of artillery and 51 standards were seized. They lost up to a third of their effective army fielded against Frederick, an enormously high percentage.
Not just contemporary observers and later historians refer to the Battle of Leuthen as Frederick the Great's finest moment. Even Napoleon acknowledged its genius. Just like at Rossbach, everything went right for Frederick. The knowledge of the battlefield, the extended enemy lines, and the cooperation of Prussian commanders like a well-oiled machine. All thanks to those autumn war game trainings. The artillery, infantry, and cavalry worked together perfectly, with subordinates taking initiative whenever the opportunity presented itself. It ended up leading to victory. Frederick did not launch a pursuit until 2 days after the battle, leading to most Austrian soldiers escaping across the border. Some sources indicate these didn't escape, but rather were pushed by Frederick's belated pursuit. The implications of Rossbach were enormously favorable regarding the French. The implications of Leuthen made an astronomical difference. Frederick faced down and beat a high morale, well-equipped, and recently victorious army. If the Austrians had beaten him, the Kingdom of Prussia would have been no more. There was no alternative to victory. After the defeat, the Austrians retreated into Bohemia. They still held Schweidnitz and Breslau. Frederick subjected Breslau to a severe bombardment, and within 2 weeks, the entire garrison surrendered. Still, you can imagine the atmosphere in Vienna. Every face is marked by anguish and panic, and the general dismay is much more intense than it was back in May following the defeat at Prague. The end of the 1757 campaign cemented Frederick's reputation as a great military commander. But Frederick himself wasn't in a triumphalist mood. He told his subordinates Leuthen had been a sticker plaster on his wounds. It had not healed everything. He saved the relief of Schweidnitz for the next year's campaigning. His army took up winter quarters. The campaign of 1757, an incredibly prolonged campaign, came to an end. Prussia fought an unusual number of battles, yet an epidemic hitting the winter quarters killed more soldiers than all those battles combined. Still, the campaign was extraordinary, with a surprising number of reverses and twists. Frederick himself referred to it as a campaign that was like 3 in 1. But the war was far from over, and the next year would bring renewed warfare, reverses, and twists. Thank you so much for watching this video. If there's a topic, battle, person, or event you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also really like to thank all my patrons and my channel members for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and you want to support my work, consider joining me on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you already gain early access to all my videos without any in-video advertisements, and your name will be featured at the end of every video. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.